being here again today. We want to acknowledge that this. I'm sorry, I've been suffering from a sore throat this whole week. So I want to thank the monitoring team for all your work and efforts and hanging in there. Um, for hanging in there with us these last four meetings. We will be asking for questions. I mean, asking for topics at the end for future meetings. I am Felicia Cross. I am the director for community engagement for the Seattle Community Police Commission. And once again, this is the fourth meeting of a four-part series to talk about the four core areas of the federal monitoring consent decree monitors assessment. I'll let him introduce and talk more about that. We'll have plenty of time today to talk, to ask questions. Want everybody to know you're welcome to ask your questions, but we will, as I always preference the meetings, start with respectful dialogue. It will be respectful dialogue. We can't have it any other way. We want to hear everybody's voice is valuable, and we really want to hear what everybody has to contribute. I just want to, you want to go ahead, Jacqueline? I want to just put out to the community to let everybody know there's been a lot of press. I'll just put it that way, about the CPC, and I just want to put it out there that the Seattle Community Police Commission was created to enhance the transparency as the city complies with the consent decree. The commission's goal is to amplify and honor community voices, concerns, and experiences, to hold police accountable and create systematic change. And I'm gonna just plug in one other part here, and this comes straight out of the ordinance for the consent decree. And this says, in the consent decree, it says, the commission's role is to help ensure the public's confidence by engaging the community to develop recommendations on police accountability system and provide a community-based perspective on law enforcement related policies, practices, and services affecting public trust. So the point I want to make here is that we are hosting these meetings on behalf of our community. So come to these meetings. We want to provide a platform. Dr. Oftelli reports straight to Judge Robart. We have others of the monitoring team on the call. There are city council people. There are a lot of different entities of our community listening on these calls. So we are here to host. We are here to provide a platform. We care about what you think. We care about what your concerns are, and we need you to see us as a partner and engage so that we can make Seattle a better place to live for all of us. With that being said, if there is nothing else, I'm not going to take up any more of the time. I will, like I said, at the end, everybody is welcome to ask their questions. We will also be monitoring the chat and getting to any of those questions. Dr. Oftelli has a list of the questions that have been brought up at some of the past meetings that he will be addressing. And if with no further ado, Dr. Oftelli, is there anyone else that you wanted promoted um, as you? Okay, Jacqueline, you can take it down. Hi, hello. Is there anyone else you wanted promoted to for tonight's call?
Well, we do have a couple members of the monitoring team on. We have Ron Ward, and I believe Vanessa Wheeler is on as well. So it's they could be promoted if you would like. Might be able to answer some questions as well.
Okay. Okay. My team will help with that. Vanessa Wheeler. I saw Ron. Okay. Take it away. It's all yours.
Great. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Felicia and CPC, for hosting tonight, and thank you all the Seattle community members for being here. I know it's taking time out of your evenings and your family life and work life to engage with all of this policing stuff, and really happy that you're here and willing to lean into this, and looking forward to the discussion tonight. What I'm hoping to do is I do have a PowerPoint, of course, because we have some tables and graphs and some insights from the assessment. So I'll share that. I'm hoping that maybe we can hold questions until the end of that. And I'll try and move through that PowerPoint in about 20 minutes. Felicia can keep me honest on that. That way you can get the full spectrum of ideas and insights, along with some of the things that the monitoring team is thinking about, that we've learned from you in previous sessions, and that we want to move forward with in the coming weeks and months. And then we can just go into some Q&A from there. So I will see if I can share. It looks like I can here. I'll do that. And so I think everyone can see that home screen there. Felicia, looks all right? Wonderful. Okay. So just a little bit of background on what we're doing tonight. I'll do this overview of the assessment process, what we've been working on there. Tonight, we'll look at the use of force comprehensive assessment and insights from that. Of course, we submitted that. Everyone has a copy of that. It is a lengthy document, so I know it's hard to wade through. So there is time to still do that even after this call, and provide any recommendations you have post this call. But we'll also talk about some high-level action items for 2022 that are based on the ideas that you guys have generated over the previous few weeks here at these sessions. And then we'll have some Q&A as well. So as a reminder of where we're at, the comprehensive assessments, there's really three major categories. There's crisis intervention, how SPD officers deal with people in crisis. There are stops and detentions. So looking at essentially what we call Terry stops, and as well as any bias or disparate impact within those stops. Tonight, we'll be looking at use of force again. That will include crowd management and the use of force statistics there. And then embedded in those three are insights around supervision, meaning just how SPD management looks at each one of those sections, their processes, their structures, their people, and how that works or doesn't work within these contexts. So we've been doing that in the context as well of these community engagement sessions, and we've really been trying to reach out to you for three primary things. So one is to ask, what specific ideas do you have to improve policing? For tonight, it's relative to use of force and data and collection around that, and accountability. Is there any research or advocacy that the CPC should be taking on in 2022 around use of force? Are there things that we should be trying to do there around policy or research? And lastly, is there any policy and practice change that you think the federal monitor should oversee in 2022 and on relative to this work? So really what we're trying to say here is these assessments are somewhat of a baseline of where Seattle Police Department is today, based on a number of metrics, pretty dry metrics, statistics. I fully understand that behind every one of those stats and the document received, as well as this PowerPoint, is a person, is a life, is an individual, is a community member. And so, I resonate with that. And this is why this work is important. And it's so important why you're here, because again, every one of these numbers represents someone or your community. And so we need to be looking at, what should we do with this? Where do we go next? And what ideas you have to take us there. That includes things like, do we need to do new types of measures going forward? Should the accountability partners do that going forward? So a number of things there that we'll cover on that. But these are the three primary goals of the preliminary assessments and these community engagement sessions, is to get feedback and ideas as to what can be done better. Well, let's go back a little bit in time here. I think I can't really see the chat too much here, but we'll come back we'll do some Q&A right at the end. I'll try and move through these slides in 15 or 20 minutes here. So just to kind of reorient where this has all come from. So in 2011, DOJ found that there's a pattern or practice of using unnecessary or excessive force by SPD, right? So we all generally know that. And so they brought a lawsuit, and some of the things that came for that was to address the failures that DOJ found in SPD policy and practice, particularly in use of force around properly monitoring or investigating use of force, implementing adequate policies for the various weapons used within force and their proper use, as well as training, very importantly. How do we actually train officers to around use of force? There was not much there back in 2011 and before around these. In fact, if many of you recall the stories when Chief O'Toole came in to SPD and asked about statistics around use of force and certain crime trends, and they pointed to a metal filing cabinet and said there might be something in there. Right? Really, nothing was collected. If it was on paper, and it was very hard to analyze. So that was the baseline for what DOJ found when they were here. So there's a few slides here that have a lot of text. I won't read it all the way through. But so what happened was, to remedy that, DOJ said, okay, here are the things that have to be done relative to the use of force. And they spelled that out in the consent decree. So use of force policies, for example, making sure that those were in place. Really rigorous reporting of all incidents from lower level to higher level force, requiring management supervision and chain of command review across all use of force. Training, a number of levels of training were mandated by DOJ in the consent decree for SPD, expanding requirements for how the force investigation teams worked, creating a use of force committee, which is now a force review board to analyze use of force, to change policy, to change practice, to see what better practices there are out there. So a number of things were put in place by DOJ, by the monitor at that point in time, working with SPD and the city and community in order to remedy this. In some ways, you could almost look at these as like emergency measures, with DOJ coming in and saying, here's just what you have to do to get to a baseline here where things are constitutional and lawful and hopefully equitable. And so those baseline activities were put into place. As part of that, one of the big things that came from that work is very clearly identifying the type of force being used by SPD. And so from that came 3 levels of use of force. Again, this wasn't categorized this way prior to the consent decree. Citizens, community members in Seattle had no way of knowing what this force was at the time. So a key area was to categorize it. We've covered this a bit in our last community engagement session when DOJ talked about this, but just at a very high level. There are 3 broad types of force, with type 1 or level 1, those are used synonymously, being the lowest level. There's a type 2 or intermediate force that can cause some physical injury, usually transitory pain. I should also say, as type 1, important to know that a pointing of a firearm is included in type 1 use of force. That was a change that was made. And type 3 is the most serious force, including force that can cause great bodily harm or death. And importantly, with all of these, policy requires that use of force be not just objectively reasonable, but also necessary and proportional. And so SPD has put that into policy, and that's the benchmark for how we try and measure these 3 types of use of force along those lines. So fast forward a little bit, and in the 9th systemic assessment, the previous monitor laid out where SPD was and found numerous areas of progress and said that SPD is doing well overall, generally speaking, on this. And so part of our starting point as the new monitoring team coming in, we were required to base our research and review on these prior assessments. And so what we did with that is take prior assessments, rebuild them to some degree for what we call the methodology for the types of areas and instance we would measure along the patterns of that and systemically, and use those as the next version of the assessment. So giving the court a temporal assessment of where SPD is around that. So let's get to then where we're at here with some of what we found in the assessments. Now, I'll say with all these, again, these are high level. The document, I think, is 60 some pages, 68 or so. I'm just, bringing out of these PowerPoints some of the top salient things. Much of this, not only from what's been in the media, but from your own lived experience. I fully realize that behind these numbers, behind these incidents, are people, and many of you were part of peacefully protesting and marching in 2020. You're included in this data, right? And so much of this, again, but we'll talk about this a bit at a high level. So we know in 2020 we had the murder of George Floyd in my hometown of Minneapolis. That caused a cascade of events, including in Seattle and across the country around protests, demonstrations, around policing in general. So SPD responded to that not well. Of course, we do have to remember that they were facing things that they had never faced before, broadly speaking, but they didn't perform well. We found the monitoring team that much of the force did not accord with the policies under the consent decree. Supervisors struggled to document and review use of force. And many of these forces use of force were outside of the guidelines for policy and practice, including policy and practice that wasn't up to speed with that type of level of protest as well. So SPD, the protest response generated about 19,000 roughly complaints. Those resulted in about 145 unique incidents that were referred to OPA. OPA has been working through those, as most of us know, via the reporting around that. To date, about 2/3 of the cases have led to a disciplinary outcome. Many of those were written or oral reprimands. 4 cases have resulted in suspension without pay, 2 cases leading to resignations prior to discipline, and there's 1 case that have led to a disciplinary transfer. There are a few other cases pending, so we'll see what happens with that. So there are some really interesting stats here around what happened from that disciplinary process, which we all, I think, have to grapple with and figure out if that was equitable, accountable, and where we go next with that. Some of the results for this, SPD did redesign its crowd management policy and training. The City Council, of course, has passed a less lethal weapons ordinance. SPD will be having to rewrite its policy based on the City Council's ordinance. That will have to go through a process with the court as well to approve that policy, and so that's ongoing right now. As well as the Sentinel Event Review, which was started to critically analyze from a systemic lens what happened during the protests, in order to inform best practice and change and outcomes and accountability around that. So there are a number of things that are in process from the use of force and the 2020 protests. If we look at this from a numeric standpoint, we can see where the spike was in 2020. Again, in the assessment document, you can see the full detail on all these numbers. Dramatic spike in 2020, mostly relative to the protests. And so apart from that, there have been some declines in use of force and some good measures, at least progress along those lines, but with a severe jump in 2020, as we see. If we look at this from a high-level assessment of just use of force in general, SPD's forces declined about 33% from 2015 to 2019 and 49% from 2015 to 2021. The most serious force incidents, type 3, have decreased by 60% from 2014 to 2021. There's also more reporting that's been happening, but all this has been, of course, thrown into question by the historic levels of protest related force by SPD. And so one of the things that we have to grapple with as a community, as the DOJ, the monitoring team, is how do we look at those two things? How do we hold both of those in our heads and figure out what's next? On one hand, SPD has made really good progress in general use of force, broadly speaking, okay? We know there's always going to be problems. There's going to be challenges. There's things that need to be fixed. And we can talk about that when we get into Q&A. But generally speaking, the trend lines have been good. However, on the other hand, there's again this historic use of force that were driven during the protests, and so how do we balance those two things? Will be critically important for all of us to be working on together. If we look a little bit at what that use of force generally excluding protest looks like, you can see the difference there between those the previous graph and this one, with the generally decreasing over time since 2015 general use of force. A little bit of a tick up in 2018. I don't know why that was. We're looking a bit at that. Generally, that was mostly type 1 use of force that 2021 2018 had a slight increase there. And so that's a question mark, I think, for a number of us as we look back at that. But broadly speaking, the trend lines are going in the right direction, and SPD has generally sustained their progress for general use of force, not including protests in those crowd management settings. Now, what's important as well is I wanted to relay, because there's a lot of questions around accountability here and failures of the accountability system. One of the things that we'll get to at the very end of this as well, but one of the things that the monitoring team will be working on in 2022 is a performance assessment of the accountability system. Getting to better understand deficiencies, what areas need to be augmented, if there are problems, if there are systems failures, and taking a look at what happened, as well as trying to work with the community to figure out ways to improve that accountability system. So the monitoring team will be looking at that very directly, starting in about May through the balance of this year. But that being said, I want to make sure that everyone knows that when we look at that, there's this, and there's a number of steps here, right, around use of force that the city uses to better understand use of force, to track it, to measure it, to have accountability around it, to create new policies and processes. None of this really was in place before the consent decree. So in many ways, when we look at these stats and the number or amount of use of the amount of force incidents, there's really no benchmark for a good or bad number in totality of force. What's most important, of course, we want to see that going down continuously, but what's most important in this context for the consent decree is that any and every use of force is reviewed, analyzed, there's accountability, there's discipline if needed, and there's learning that takes place for the overall system. So those 7 steps are in place right now. Reporting of use of force, the supervisors looking at it, force review units, force investigation teams looking at that, the force review board, which OPA and OIG sit on, OPA investigating complaints, as well as anything that comes up from the force review board or from community members, and OIG having more of a backstop looking at that systemically to see if it's all working. I know that there are many people on this call tonight that would say that that whole 7-step process broadly does not work. And so we should discuss that and figure out what we can do to improve that, and the range of that, some of which maybe could be advocated for under the consent decree. Some of it may need to be pushed by CPC, by other entities, by the Seattle Human Rights Commission, for example, in order to move different forms of accountability forward. I know there's a lot of ideas on how that can be done. So with that 7-step process, there are some findings broadly of how that works. Overall, SPD, with I'm sure gaps that many of us will talk about, demonstrates consistent adherence to that flow, that process. So, for example, supervisors continue to document more substantive review of use of force, and that process is working quite well. One interesting stat, I think, that at least we can try and be hopeful around is that previously, SPD only referred about 0.4% of any force cases for further review. Now that's about 13% of even the lowest level cases. So if I go out a little bit on a limb here, and some of you, of course, will argue with me on that, but that's a good sign in that it shows that SPD is willing and able and proactive at documenting use of force, discussing it, and reporting it. Whereas previously, they weren't as inclined, right? And so there's not only processes and structures around that, but maybe there's a cultural piece there as well that's improving within SPD to really say, hey, we can learn from this. We have to document. We have to be really clear with this. So a number of things there that are working well around use of force and reporting, of course, with gaps that we'll talk about and address. Part of that is looking, of course, at the serious type 3 uses of force over time. This graph is broken down into officer shootings and other type 3 force, which can cause bodily harm that can last. So there is a broad decline generally from 2014 to 2021 on SPD's use of force, type 3 use of force. This is a good set of metrics and statistics on this. Progress is being made. Now, of course, any type 3 use of force, of course, is horrible for not only the community member, but oftentimes the officer involved or officers, right? And so every one of these uses of force is analyzed and reviewed again by that seven-step process I talked about earlier, and findings are made from that. We can also spend a lot of time disagreeing on those findings and what happens with that accountability system, and I think we should, because that helps us to move to something better over time. There are many instances that we can look at to discuss on that. As I mentioned before in previous sessions, the role of the monitor and their monitoring team is to look at this systemically. Via the court, the monitoring team does not look at individual cases, but we look at the systemic trends. That being said, personally / professionally, I know there are cases within this set of type 3s that I think communities should be looking at. CPC should be looking at, other partners to not only learn from what happened, but to relook at accountability with those, to change policy and practice potentially going forward in many of those cases that we've talked about on previous calls. Again, the monitoring team can't look at those individually, but the community can. CPC can to some degree, and so we can all somehow work together to address those. Within these stats, for example, in 2020 is Terry Caber, right? From my, being careful how I talk about it because I'm federal monitor, but a case that I've looked at, again, I have to look systemically, but when I put on my personal hat and look at that case individually, it's very problematic as to how that particular killing happened. So what do we do about that? How do we change policy and practice going forward from those particular horrific incidences? And that's something we need to grapple with going forward. Another metric around that is rates of force per dispatch. And so broadly here again, there's a decline in the use of force if we look at it from a activity level from SPD officers. So how many are going out in the field, how many are called out into calls, the number of incidents, the use of force per dispatch. And so there has been a decline there generally year over year, again, with a slight uptick in 2018 with type 1 uses of force, but broadly decline, as well as a spike though in 2020 because of the protests. So again, balancing this in our minds, on one hand, there is decent trends, good trend lines for SPD where they sustain progress from the previous monitors' assessments on general use of force, but there are some big upticks there from during the protests. As well as maybe a third piece we put in, which is looking at all of this in the context of disparate impact, disparity. As we talked about in previous sessions, the consent decree does not have directly in it in paragraphs directions or rules around disparity and looking at that, but it is in the spirit of the consent decree to be looking at bias and disparate impact in policing in a broad sense. And so when we look at that, we found that again in stops and detentions, as we had that conversation a few weeks ago, with the disparities quite glaring there. And this is the same in use of force. So if we look at that statistically, we can see on this particular table here that the disparity in that. And of course, we can hone in on particularly the Black community, the Asian community, and American Indian community. The Black community representing from a population-based metric, 7.3% of the population, but they experience 36.4% of arrests, 37% of type 1 force, 34% of type 2 force, and 54% of type 3 force. And so we see the disparities on there, and that's something that we all need to work on and address in ongoing work. So some high level findings based on that, as with some of the other assessments. The distribution of this force does not resemble the racial makeup of Seattle. There's disparity there. For example, in 2019 to 21, Black subjects were involved in the highest number of the most serious types of force. And so one, as well as Asians and American Indians, Native Americans. There's also some interesting things to parse here. There was a 73% decrease of pointings of lethal firearms at Black individuals from 2015 on. However, they're still much more likely to be subject to a firearm pointing. Things like this are really problematic in the context of a lot of research out there. We know, for example, that for youth, particularly for youth in K-12, if they experience a firearm pointed at them by a police officer, as nationwide research, their educational attainment is impacted. They're more likely to drop out of school. There's trauma associated with a pointing of a firearm. So what sometimes seems maybe not that big of a deal to some people is extremely terrifying and traumatizing to people to have a gun pointed at them, right? And so this type of stat is it's troubling, right? There has been progress there, but there's still much more progress that needs to be made. So when we look at all of that, I do want to take just a second to talk about some of the, and I'm getting to, Felicia, I'm almost done, getting to some of the initiatives for 2022 that will embed in the monitoring plan relative to use of force. A lot of this was driven by the ideas that have come from you during these community engagement sessions on things that we should be tackling and addressing head on going forward. So one, as I mentioned before, we will be doing an accountability system performance assessment, looking at OPA and OIG and CPC and that general 7-step accountability system to see what improvements can be made there, what enhancements, structures, systems, processes, technologies, people, et cetera, need to be augmented there. And we'll be doing that this year. The Sentinel event review will continue that OIG is leading. There will be a revised use of force and crowd management policy that will be put in place this year. We are looking to do an improved edged weapons policy and training for SPD. They already do have a generally good policy there, generally good, meaning that many of other departments nationwide, the ICAT standards, for example, were built off SPD standards, but there still is a lot of room for improvement. And there's been two or three, 4 cases just in the past 2 years here where people with knives or edged weapons have been killed, and those, there's learning that needs to take place there, as well as review and accountability. There will be an anti-bias policing plan and training plan put into place this year that we'll be working with you all on. We'll continue the work around active bystandership and peer intervention, what we call the ABLE trainings, where officers are required to intervene if they see another officer doing something wrong. as well as we're going to be working on with OIG and OPA and everyone, enhanced data usability, accessibility, and transparency. Even though the city of Seattle has one of the better data governance management systems, open data dashboards, there still is sometimes a lot of confusion around what is in that dashboard and what isn't. And there's a lot of change and innovation that can happen there to make that just better, broadly speaking, right? So even if they are one of the leaders in the country, there's room to be better on that. So those are an example of some of the things we'll be working on this year to address a lot of the opportunities as well as challenges that have been brought up from these assessments, as well as been elevated by you as community members in advocating for change and that continuous change going forward. That also being said, there are a number of things, again, that community members can move forward on independently of the monitor, things that are not within the jurisdiction of the monitor, so to say, that community members can be pushing on with CPC and with other accountability entities or organizations to continue improvement. And that's important because as the monitoring team won't be here forever, DOJ won't be in town forever. So as we transition that work over to community, having you stand up and really take the lead on new things, new innovations, new ideas will be exceptionally important going forward. So with that, I know I kind of rushed through that a bit, but I wanted to make sure we covered those broad strokes. And we can take some Q&A. Felicia, I think I'll stop sharing if that's okay, so I can see okay, but I can always pop up those slides again if we need to.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yes.
So here's you guys' opportunity to ask your questions. Once again, I am going to request respectful dialogue. We want to hear, honor, and receive everybody's concerns and questions. So please, respectful dialogue. Let's see.
And Felicia,
Yes.
Can we make sure too that we can get a copy of the chat, so that if there's questions we missed there, we can make sure that they're addressed, or just comments, or just things like that?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. We're tracking. We're tracking.
And let me mention. I'm sorry. Let me mention again as well that we have had a series of questions that have come in through the previous meetings. It does take some time to gather the responses to those. We do have that in process. We will not only post responses to all those questions on the monitoring website, but we'll provide them to CPC so those can be emailed out. There we had a number of questions from Dr. Gale that were included in there, from Agnes that were included in there, from general ones from CPC. So we are working on that, and we will be providing clear answers back to the community and all those.
Great. Okay, let's go with the questions. Let me see how to do this here. Sorry.
I can if you want, I can kind of go back up to the top of the list, and we can kind of work down in the chat. Is that?
I've actually captured some of the questions, so I can read the first one if you would like, Dr. Oftelli.
Sure.
Okay. So the first question is, does anything prevent you and the judge from commenting on the labor contract once both sides have negotiated?
In my role, I'm not, I can't access any of that, right? I am not, what's the term? I'm not privy to it, so to say, right? The court also does not have access to those, to the negotiations, or to the agreement, the pre-agreements, I'm forgetting the technical term for it, that form the basis for the negotiations. The judge will only see the final version. And at that point in time, the judge could, issue some type of a statement from the bench on it, as well as hold potentially hold accountability open in the consent decree based on whether or not the court thinks that contract is upholding the accountability, the foundations that the court has previously talked about as importance to that, right? So back in the last contract, the court, as part of finding the city out of compliance, listed a number of things that were crucial to the contract. And so whether or not those happen within this next version, I'm sure the court will have some say on there. But unfortunately, I personally, as a monitor in the monitoring team, do not have access or involvement in those negotiations.
Okay. I have seen Agnes Governor hand up first, and can you unmute?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
can hear you.
And Felicia, I'm part of a two-part team that's gonna, so I hope you can unmute Kim Prosciutto as well. So, because her comments are part of mine. Well, good evening, and I'm Agnes Govern, and together with Kim Prosciutto, we are presenting comments on behalf of Proactive Persistent People for Progress, which is a local group working to strengthen democracy and advocate for progressive issues. I want to thank the CPC for providing this venue. I think it's been very important. And I want to thank the Federal Monitor for giving us twice as many days to review the multi-page document as you did last time. We got 4 days instead of 2. So
Agnes, I know you're a very fast reader, right? So it's my pleasure to give you 2 more days. I gave you more time.
I'm going to talk about just some general comments that seem to recur not only in this specific assessment, but throughout things that we've been looking at in terms of policing in Seattle. The first is there seems to be widespread recognition of a need to build public trust, that we have to move beyond the constitutional policing that the Federal Monitor and the consent decree has set, and really move to a policing that meets community expectations. So I think we all need to keep that in mind because that's so much beyond what we've ever talked about here. Second, it's really concerning to us that there is a movement to roll back police accountability reforms by using increasing crime statistics to foster fear. And we understand people's concerns when faced with rising crime, either personally or through community stories, but we're especially concerned how those opposed to more accountable policing are using the current environment of rising crime to roll back important reforms. We saw that happen in our state legislature. We're concerned about it happening at the city level. We agree with Mayor Harrell's statement, which is we can have safety and we can have police reform. And in that regard, I would ask the monitor that we continue to be disappointed that you don't reflect perspectives reported in the independent media. There's many important stories there, the Proud Boys Roost, for example, that really came out of independent media, and we really don't see that reflected in any of your assessments. Third, one of the themes is it's very clear that there's a strong desire by the city and the police monitor to see the consent decree ended. Yet there's no plan in place to ensure adequate police accountability structures are in place. I was delighted to hear that the monitor is planning to look at the accountability structures and work to strengthen them. Because as we've reviewed this, what's set in line looks good, but if you really look at the OPA seems to be constantly hobbled by the terms of the union contract, and unacceptable behavior goes with no consequences. The CPC has done a marvelous job of doing a lot of work over more than a decade, but they really have inadequate authority to affect change. Many of their recommendations simply do not even get responded to by the Seattle Police Department. And so when you look at the accountability structures, we really hope that you will be very directive in looking at some of these problems. The other real problem is a delay in review, discipline, and any change procedures. I mean, here we are almost 2 years past the 2020 event, and we still have investigations ongoing. And how that kind of delay is expected to ever result in community trust when you literally wait years to hear what actually has happened to individual police officers who haven't followed procedure. We do really want to acknowledge the work done by both the Seattle Police Department and the city's police accountability structures to achieve these statistical reports that you have just referenced in your assessment. It's clear based on your statistics that there have been significant changes. However, what we're really troubled by is a lack of recognition by the monitor that really statistics only tell part of the story. And without an understanding of individual and disparate community impact, it's an incomplete story. The police monitors' continued lack of understanding that these statistics ignore the realities of individual people who've been harmed, in some cases killed, by use of force by the Seattle Police Department is dismaying. We heard a lot about that at the last community engagement meeting. As a community, we need to hold both realities together. We need to recognize that the SPT and many officers have embraced change, but there are still instances where grievous harm is done. And the police monitor's inability to recognize those two realities, we think adds additional harm and serves as an obstacle to a move toward community legitimacy that we all really want in terms of our policing function. And again, we have to highlight that there continues to be disparate impact to African Americans. The assessment points out that Black subjects were involved with the highest number of intermediate or serious force. And we are most concerned that officers report race unknown in over a third of their reports. So the systemic issues that must be addressed in terms of that and the lack of the monitor's urgent action to address that specific issue is very concerning. Kim is going to talk about some specific comments on this report.
Thank you. Thanks, Agnes. So the assessment examines the events of 2020 as a separate category and notes that SPD's response really reverted to pre-consent decree behaviors, the very kind of behaviors that caused the consent decree to be initiated. And we appreciate that OIG, the SIR reports are continuing, and we're going to be learning more about those 2020 details. And we're also glad to hear that you're going to be evaluating the accountability systems as part of your 2022 work plan. Part of our concern arises from the fact that your assessment misses a critical part of SPD's response to the protests, namely the role of SPD's command staff at the assistant chief and captain level. And we hope you'll be including that in the future. We agree with the monitor's recommendation that SPD must work with CPC, OPA, and OIG to craft alternative force reporting and review mechanisms for future protests. We're a little alarmed that that hasn't happened in the 2 years nearly that have intervened between those events and this reporting date. Circling back to recurring themes outlined at the beginning of our comments tonight, the absence of such mechanisms does not bode well for SPD's internalizing the imperative to pursue structural legitimacy, and nor does it bode well for SPD's capacity to operate to facilitate effective and trust-building policing following the conclusion of the consent decree. So we have a couple of specific questions for you tonight. One is, a previous assessment identified specific units and geographical locations where racially disparate results were found. And this assessment notes that a few officers use force with greater frequency in a given year. One officer using force more than 20 times in 2020, and outside the protest period, 4 officers used intermediate or serious force 10 or more times in 2019 to 2021. And you wrote that this merits close analysis. We'd like you to be more specific. What kind of analysis, by whom, and by when? Our second question is, what are your recommendations regarding the finding that Black subjects are involved with the highest number of intermediate or series of force events? Our third question is, the assessment states that there are potentially troubling implications for continued compliance with the consent decree, given that unclear demographic data collection is increasing. So this is even more problematic if the consent decree is ended. What specifically do you recommend in terms of best practices? And our fourth question is just a detailed question, which is the assessment includes information that indicates fewer officer dispatches in recent years. In 2015 to 2019, it was about 850 dispatches per year. And in 2020 and 21, about 655 dispatches. We know the pandemic is often given as a reason for this data anomaly during the years, but how does that information factor into the increasing crime rates? In conclusion, we believe that the new police contracts currently being negotiated with management and the Guild will determine whether or not Seattle continues to move forward on its efforts to create a transparent, accountable, trusted, and effective SPD that meets the expectations of all the communities it serves. In its earlier rulings, the federal court overseeing the consent decree found that the 2018 union contracts rolled back important 2017 police accountability legislation and admonished the city and SPD that the city will remain under the consent decree until accountability is addressed in a sustainable way. There was a question that you answered earlier about whether you'll have the opportunity to review the contract before it is voted upon. And it seems to us that such a review is critical, because to enter into a contract for 4 more years that the court is only going to turn around and say you cannot exit the consent decree leaves us stuck with a terrible contract, just like we were in 2018. So we'd like to ask you and the other organizations present if there is not some way to have visibility into this and it's some kind of an evaluation prior to signing the contract. We understand that negotiations on the new contract with SPMA are nearly complete, and negotiations with SPOG have begun and will be informed in a major substantial way by the SPMA contract. While this assessment is focused on use of force, it's impossible to separate accountability from the union contracts. Inasmuch as this was a major factor in the imposition of oversight, we would like to have seen some discussion of the upcoming union contracts. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kim and Agnes for all that very important analysis. Thank you for that and the questions. I'll start with the last piece. The union contracts are I fully agree. I guess that's what I would say. The structure of how those contracts are negotiated is and some on the left, and maybe Ron Ward here can correct me, but I believe it's in city statute as to how that's structured, who can see it, who can't, at what point in times. It may be that those city council would have to re-look at how that is put into place. Kim, I don't have a clear answer for how that can be changed. I do wish community could be more actively involved in that. The court could be, CPC could be, we could get more behind the scenes and look at what's being negotiated and try and inform the next version of that contract. I share your frustration on that, and so I guess the only clear takeaway there is hopefully we can collectively here, community, CPC, and others look at that and see if there's any possible way to be more actively engaged there. Right now, I'm pretty much legally barred from doing that, right? So, but maybe there's a way community can help there. So, in that you're right, in that there's so much riding on that contract around accountability. We're going to be in a bad spot if it doesn't go well, right? Depending on the person's point of view, of course, right? So extremely important, and I wish I had more that I could do there and respond to that. The previous question around the documentation of race in not only stops and detentions, but also in use of force. That's something we've flagged with the monitoring team and in the PowerPoint here, as well as the assessment. You're right, it's about 32% roughly of incidents are undocumented. That is something that we will be requiring work on this year. And so that is a gap that will be fixed. We've already been in dialogue with SPD on that. I don't know exactly why that 32% is the case. There are perhaps some technical reasons for that with the switchover around incident management systems and data collection, where maybe even very granular, like the box wasn't checked. Or is it something a bit deeper and more culturally nefarious, like officers have not wanted to check that box, so to say, in order to avoid repercussions. So that's something we don't know the root cause of that gap, but it is being reviewed now and looked at, and that will be something that will be fixed this year. There will be a plan in place on that. Your second question around the major disparity areas. There are a number of things that the monitoring team will be overseeing and that the accountability partners will be working on collectively with community this year. What we're calling the anti-bias and disparate impact plan is something that needs to be advanced. We don't have much on paper with that other than what SPD currently has. They do have what they call there's a bias, essentially a bias plan. I'm forgetting the actual technical name of it, but that needs to be augmented, and that's something we'll be working on this year. In a lot of documentation with the number of assessments we had there, getting to the root cause of disparity is a complex subject and a big one, right? That we have to work across agencies on. SPD is at the street level of that, right? And so how they analyze that better going forward is going to be exceptionally important. Doing things like propensity score matching and other types of analysis to get to what's driving some of those disparities, including if there is bias in that, and if it's a race-based disparity, is there racism, involved in that? So getting better and more clear understanding of that, and then dealing with that. As well as working across agencies to better understand how do we get to root cause across the things that drive a lot of these disparities around housing policy, education policy and disparate impact, the justice system broadly speaking, et cetera, right? We know there are a lot of factors that are in place here. So that's probably one of the biggest, most challenging items is disparity and disparate impact. In policing and in health and human services and in education, all these. And so it's going to take a lot of effort for all of us to address that. You had a question around the frequency of force and looking at that smaller set of officers who seem to use force more frequently. We don't know why that is. We will be looking at that and trying to understand what that is. There's anecdotally, when you look at nationwide at policing, there tends to be that type of dynamic. And sometimes, I'm not saying this is the case in Seattle because we don't know, sometimes officers that are a bit more proactive, so to say, they like to be on, taking a lot of calls, they often will have more instances of force. That doesn't necessarily mean that their force is unconstitutional or unlawful, right? It just means they have more of it. Or is it that there are certain officers who are not trained well, or they are breaking rules, right, and need to be held need to be reviewed from that perspective, right? So that supervision angle of those officers is going to be important to look at, and that's something we'll be working with SPD on this year to at least understand what the cause of that is. What's happening with those particular officers will be part of that work. you had, I think there was one other question in here that I think Agnes had posed. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. The command staff. Agnes, or Kim, I can't remember who brought up that. It's a great question. It's something that you are right that it has not really been, I suppose, adequately addressed in the assessments around crowd management, use of force, and the command staff roles. We do know that, of course, that Interim Chief Diaz held a few people, at the command staff level accountable for that. One of them was demoted, et cetera. And so there has been some accountability there, but we haven't looked at that particular angle around should there be changes from the command staff angle. I don't have a good answer for that particular piece, other than I think you're right, and that it's something that has been looked at from the central event review process, but not from the assessments. And so I will take that back as a question to the team to look at what we, if anything, we can do there on those pieces. Agnes, one of your earlier points, yes, we are going to be looking, doing this performance assessment of the accountability system. I'm hopeful there that we can, in cooperation with community, elevate a number of things, concerns, and then critically analyze those to figure out what's wrong and what could be better, right? Sarah Lippick has a question in the chat that goes directly to that. For example, this is a gap that Sarah's identified, that others have identified in the media when OPA is doing an investigation, for example, and that might not flow back into fit FRB. And so there's kind of a gap there, right? As those systems and structures were created over the previous few years, they are generally pretty good in comparison to other cities. But as any entity, any organization, any set of people working on things, as it evolves and matures, you're going to find gaps and problems with it, right? And so that's what we want to look at. And Sarah, I know we'll get this chat, but it'd be fantastic if you could email that to me as well, because it is something we're aware of, but I want to make sure that it's on the front burner when we do this this review. And I'm hoping that review will come out with findings and recommendations that the city can move forward with, right? That will, Agnes, to your point, provide a better foundation for accountability going forward, more than what we have now. There is no perfect accountability system, but hopefully we can get at least a bit more towards that. So I think that addresses most of your questions, Agnes and Kim. So thank you for those. And I think maybe we should move into some of the other ones because there's a bunch more pending here, Felicia.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tilly and Kim and Agnes. We're going to go with Dr. Gill. Dr. Gill's hand is up, and then we will start taking some of the questions out of the chat. This is a good conversation. If we need to go over, I'll let you guys make that decision. I'll let you, the community, make that decision. But hopefully, let's try to stay within our time restraints. Dr. Gill.
Yeah, actually, respectfully, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'd respectfully like to request that any people on this call, and I can't see who's on it, that are impacted or from impacted families go first. And if, so I'd like to give that some time. I'd like impacted people to take center stage here. And then I'd like you to return to me. Thanks.
Okay. I don't see any hands going up. Is there anybody that would like to say anything that has been impacted by SPD or any of this process? Okay, Dr. Gill, the floor is yours.
I have to unmute again. And again, if someone does, Felicia, if someone does throw their hand up and notes that they're impacted, I will step aside.
Okay.
There's a lot to go over. I did go through the 66 pages, but I just want to point out a few things, sort of, first of all, start with a high level. On page 17, you talk about the significant changes from, or the learning from 2020. And you point out two things: more detailed departmental policies and training for officers, Dr. Artelli. So policies and training. I think what we're discovering is the consent decree sort of had three parts to it: training, policy, and accountability. What I would argue is, I don't know of any area of endeavor in which you can have the best training, the best policy, and have them work if you don't have accountability. There's no reason for an officer to follow a policy or training if there's no accountability. So I think we have this completely backwards. Now, going to accountability. In your report, you point out 145 unique OPA investigations involving 179 officers. I was at many of the demonstrations. Sarah Lippick is an attorney for many of the people that have been injured. It's just an absurd number. And in fact, we have people on this call that can actually inform us as to how the OPA has reduced complaints to things like contacts, has lost complaints. Very suspiciously, they've never explained it. They were so overwhelmed with tens of thousands of complaints that they used kind of a donated Microsoft AI system to somehow consolidate them. We don't know how many were lost. I can tell you right now. I filed a complaint, not a protest complaint, but a complaint on the for the murder of Terry Caver in May of 2020. That complaint got lost. It simply got lost. And in fact, it was lost and never found until Paul Kiefer reported that I was able to show detailed evidence that I had submitted it. Anyway, moving on from that, here are some of the things that I think are very problematic. I'll just pick out a couple of things. On page 41, you have a list of reported applications of less lethal devices during 2020 protests. One of the things that caught my attention is blast balls. Now, none of the other items on there are similar to blast balls. There are flashbangs. Not too many of those were used, but whatever. It lists here 182 blast balls were used. The reason I have a problem with that is on Sunday, June 7th, going into Monday, June 8th, if folks remember, June 8th is when the East Precinct was abandoned. I was there from 8 at night until about 1:30 in the morning on Monday. I counted between midnight and 10 minutes after midnight over 100 blast balls. Now, I'm not that good that I could, certainly so many blast balls were thrown, numerous ones were thrown simultaneously, that it's probably a considerable undercount. My point here is if in 10 minutes, 100 blast balls were thrown, how is it even conceivable that 182 were thrown over the course of months? So I think we have a serious problem here with the use of force reporting. That's just one indication. I'll give you another brief indication from the data. On page 30, you talk about type 3 use of force for the entire year 2020. Supposedly there are 18 type 3 uses of force. And on page 36, you claim that 6 of those 18 are related to protests. I personally know at least 15 people that suffered serious permanent injuries. So again, I think we have a problem with data. I'll give you another example just very quick. I noticed in 2016, there were 2 type 3 uses of force. May 1st, 2016, during a 4-hour period, there was a May Day demonstration, which I followed and videoed and documented. That was the demonstration in which an independent reporter got his cheek blown apart by a blast ball. I know at least 4 reporters that actually got serious injuries on their feet or lower limbs. There was a cop that was injured. So again, it's befuddling how in the entire year of 2016, there's 2 type 3 uses of force. So very quickly, I'm just going to go through some other issues. But before I do that, I want to ask Dr. Oftelli a question. Do you know how uses of force reports actually go through the system?
Yeah, broadly, I do, yes.
Well, okay. So my question, I won't play 20 questions here. The question is this. Uses of force reports, for people that don't know this, an officer who deploys whatever, uses force or deploys ammunition, then writes a report detailing why he did it, what he did, et cetera, if he saw any injuries, That goes back and forth through the chain of command. Typically, it'll go to a sergeant, a lieutenant, it'll go back and forth. And I've looked at these reports, and sometimes you'll see dates where it's gone back and forth through 5 different viewings. Are you aware that there is absolutely no audit trail?
And OIG is there to do audits of that entire.
No, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. Audit trail. What I mean by that is in most criminal justice systems and most police departments, there's an audit trail to know who opened a document, who looked at it, who changed it, to actually monitor the changes. And this is very important because I have evidence, and a lot of other people have looked at this, that often use of force reports, an officer will say, I threw a blast ball. And then the sergeant will say, look, you got to come up with a better, story than that. So we don't know how they are rewritten, because if we did know, here's the important thing. A use of force document, unlike a lot of other police reports, is actually a testimony. If they lie on a use of force report, that would be an impeachment. So it's very important to know, how is that use of force report changed? This is a complaint that I made at least 6 years ago now. I made it to the OPA, I made it to the CPC, and nothing has been done about it. Again, this is important because it would give us an opportunity to see how honest are the officers in writing these reports. Okay, I'm going to fast forward through a few other things here. You talk about on page 3, the Office of Inspector General initiated an in-depth Sentinel event review with community partners, and you laud that process. What you don't reveal, and what the public doesn't know, because I've gone through the actual Sentinel event review documents, there were 23 people that were originally convened to have these Sentinel event reviews. 13 of the 23 people are current or past members of the current oversight system, SPD, OIG, or CPC. 5 were paid consultants. The remaining 5 from the community were all either executive directors of nonprofit or for-profit entities or academics. So very little community representation. Now, most important, the final Sentinel event review panel consists of 12 members. 5 are from the SPD. 3 of the officers from the SPD committed some of the most heinous abuses of 2020. 2 of the people on the panel are OIG and CPC. 1 is a University of Washington professor, and 3 again are either executive directors of nonprofits or from business interests. There is literally, out of 12 members of that panel, 1 community person who advertised himself as a protester, was not injured or harmed by police, and no one knew him. Again, my point is, throughout this entire process, we have excised the voices of those harmed by police. How can this be an authentic process? How can it be trustworthy when a lot of people have put it in the comments? We don't even know what's behind the data. So I think I'll, one other very important point. I mean, again, I spent a lot of time reading this. One very important point. On page 4, you point out, while batons were present during the 2020 protests, they were used for purposes of pushing or guiding, not as an impact tool. And in a number of places, you report on the reduction of the use of batons. The reason for that, again, if you had protesters at these meetings, if you had protesters informing you, you would know a very simple truth. Police now, in the last 15 years, beat people with bicycles. There is no reason to use batons. If they use a bicycle, it's not considered a use of force tool. They don't have to make a report. They simply say they're protecting an area or they're pushing people back. So I think, again, we're missing the reality. There's a gap between the data and reality. And last thing here, in January 24th of this year, I made the claim 3 months ago now that there are 9 people killed by the police in mental health crisis that are missing from the crisis intervention data set. This is 3 months with it unanswered. I got an email, I don't know if she's on the call tonight, but I got an email from SPD's lawyer, Rebecca Boatwright. basically, in the email back and forth from her, what she told me is when you choose between data and reality, the SPD data is of such high quality that data wins. I have the emails. I'm happy to share it in the chat. She actually said if there's a discrepancy, she basically told me, even though I gave her the 9 names and the dates of the people killed during the 6.5-year period, instead of looking that up and being willing to make an analysis, she gave an abstract and absurd claim that if we didn't categorize it, then it couldn't have happened. So again, these are just tiny insights into a lot of the problems with data, and I think we do need to move beyond that.
Thank you, Dr. Gill. Just on the very last point, we do have that included in the list of questions that were submitted, and we'll have a full answer to that. In a nutshell, with there is that those 9 are reflected in the data. There is a difference in how you would classify someone in crisis than what SPD does. So there is, I know they reached out to you to discuss that. Their methodology for determining that, and I'm not sure where that now stands. If you're going to discuss
actually, I don't mean to interrupt, but I want to be really clear here. I gave them 9 names and 9 dates of people killed. 7 of those were unambiguous. For example, the person killed on January 5th in Beacon Hill, running naked, barefoot. I think we can agree that's a behavioral crisis. Terry Caver, a paranoid schizophrenic. I think we can agree that
Terry Caver was classified as a person in crisis. That's yes.
Yeah.
Not sure in the last
all these let me just finish. 7 of the 9 calls, there's when I say they're unambiguous, from the moment the 911 call was made, in every step of the process, they were identified as behavioral crisis, number 1. Number 2, the actual policy guidelines for how do you identify a behavioral crisis, it's not called a mental health crisis, it's called a behavioral crisis, which means someone could just be having a bad day. It's actually a very expansive definition. And so for the SPD, for Rebecca Boatwright to write back to me and say to me, as a psychologist, Dr. Gale, you understand how complex this is insulting and absurd. Again, we don't have to argue about this. I provided the 9 names, I provided the 9 dates. The simplest response would have been, we made a mistake, we didn't make a mistake, but instead it's an abstract debate about how you categorize people.
Sure. Okay,
when
so
it's really
we understand, Dr. Gill. So I think maybe what we can do with that situation is, again, you're from your clinical standpoint have a set of different definitions around person in crisis than SPD. Maybe we can put those 2 on paper, and the community can augment the policy for SPD as to what determines whether someone is in crisis or not, and come with a better understanding what that means for all of us, right? So
no, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt. It's no question that Terry Caver was in crisis.
Yes, Terry Caver was documented to be in crisis.
But he was killed and he's not in the data set.
He is in the data set as a person in crisis.
We'll
provide the answer to that, right?
I don't want to cut you off, Dr. Gill, and I absolutely appreciate all of the efforts and comments you've brought into this. We've spent a lot of time on those 9, and I get it. Yes. And I've looked at them myself. Not to say that I'm an expert at distinguishing the documentation. I know that Rebecca Boatwright. So what I would like to offer is that because I am asking anybody and everybody on the call, please put in the chat, email me some future topics, some things you want to go back to revisit at outside of the monitoring assessments, but as a community, things that we need to look dive deeper into, and that being one of them. So instead of we're everybody's full aware of your concerns about that, Dr. Gill, because and you have been very, very adamant and articulate about it. So not to cut you off, but I would like to bring the experts in the room, and just like Dr. Oftelli was alluding to, dissect, just have like maybe one whole meeting to dissect how that data was inputted, and follow a couple of the cases from the call all the way through. That's a suggestion. I don't think that's unfair to ask. So
it's a great suggestion.
yeah, thank you, and we're going to move on, but I am not being disrespectful to your or dismissive of your concerns and comments. I appreciate you.
Felicia,
So,
just one broad response to Dr. Gale's question is because it connects with some of the questions in the chat. So people asked, how are we ensuring that this data is reliably and consistently captured? Does this data come from Jerome Drescher is asking, does this data come from SPD use of force reports? A lot of this, right? One of the fundamental things that I think we all have to think about, grapple with a bit, make some judgments on going forward is going back to when the consent decree was started. DOJ, put this, rules in place, right? Here's what needs to be done in Seattle, right? We need to collect, define use of force, collect data, analyze it, right? We had put that on the city to do for SPD in the city to build that data model, the governance, the warehousing, the assessment, the analysis, et cetera. Over those roughly 8 years or so, one of the better data management systems in the country has been built by the city of Seattle with everyone's tax dollars that are on this call, right? It is a model that many other cities look to for how to become a learning organization, to become more transparent and effective, et cetera. That being said, the monitor relies, as we all do, on SPD data. Just like in the education system, we rely on their data, the court system, we rely on their data. The trust of that data is going to be important for all of us going forward. And so if there are ways to make sure that we can build trust in what's being collected and analyzed and reported, let's figure that out together. Some of the implications of this conversation we just had, it sounds like there isn't trust in what officers are reporting or what the chain of command may change or report, or going downstream, what OPA may do with that data, what they put forward. So if there are things we can improve there, we should. What we probably wouldn't want to do is stand up a completely separate, independent data collection entity in Seattle to go along with every officer every day to track what they're doing and input data into some handheld device, right? We'd probably not quite feasible. So what do we do with that to make sure those things are better? Body cameras help, right? And we know that. Audit trails, I think we could look at that. Maybe that's can be something that can be improved. Just as much transparency as possible, making sure the dashboard is more clear, is more usable, things like that will help. So ideas that all of you have on how to make that data collection better, the reporting better, to build trust in that system is going to be, it's crucial going forward. And so, we all as a community have to rely on the data that's collected on the ground by officers, and that's flows upward into this overall data lake in that system. And so whatever we can do to make that happen, we need to work on.
okay. I know that Sarah's hand was up. Sarah, did you still have a question or comment? Sarah Lippick. Sorry for messing up your name. Are you there? Let's see. Is she unmuted?
Sarah can unmute if that's what they
Okay.
would like.
Would you like to talk, Sarah?
Hi, the option to talk just popped up in the last moment. I had raised my hand earlier because Howard had asked people to raise their hands if they had been impacted by police violence, but we've moved on in the conversation.
No.
I'm actually, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm actually not able to stay till the end of the meeting, and I've got a client obligation starting in 3 minutes. So I'm gonna have to send more documentation and more letters and more emails. Dr. Aftelli, the letter that you're talking about earlier that you asked if it would be nice if I emailed it to you, just wanted you to know I emailed it to you in the past already. So I will email it again. I think I put everything that I have the capacity to put in the chat right now, and I will continue to try to use all of our forums. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize that we ran out of time. I saw someone else's hand. I see you, Austin. I saw someone else's hand that said they were have been impacted. Castile. I think. Hightower?
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I don't know exactly what the question was, but my brother, Herbert Hightower Jr., was killed by Seattle police in 2004 while he was experiencing a mental health crisis. His killer, Steve Herjak, was elevated to assistant chief of police and was recently demoted to captain due to the pink umbrella incident that involved chemical weaponry that the Seattle City Council later banned, but which I believe has now been reversed. So we have not only been impacted police officers who killed, Black and brown men, women, children, uh, uh, prior to George Floyd, but were alive to see his killer elevated due to the lack of accountability that has been perpetuated throughout SPD, which has brought us here to the consent decree specifically, and allow him to be elevated. We had to watch that. He's still working with an SPD as well as captain, as I stated earlier. So having to as well attend the last meeting where I was disrespected. Since we're talking about respect, I heard a comment about being respectful earlier when I actually was disrespected by a few members of CPC. The last meeting that we had, in which it seemed as if I was dismissed. My brother's life was dismissed. Those who have been impacted directly, some of which Dr. Gill talked about having parts of their body blasted away, being beaten by objects, not being classified correctly. The conversation about a gentleman who was naked and hearing the justification of the lack of classification, not being someone who is directly impacted, is insulting. It's egregious. It's horrendous. It's triggering. We as a community shouldn't have to deal with this added trauma, added disregard, added silencing of our stories, of what we continue to go through as community members, whether they were harmed physically, emotionally, mentally, even having to witness this level of egregiousness and disregard for human life. So please do not lecture me about respect when we're out here fighting for our lives, mourning the ones that have been killed and snatched away from us, being psychologically traumatized, our bodies violated over and over again, and hearing these conversations based on semantics, based on what ifs, and are quite frankly gaslighting us into reality that simply does not exist. So, I'm here as a witness, as well as an impacted family member, forever thankful for so many of the voices that have spoken up and challenged this insulting rhetoric that has continued to just drum on again and again. So if that would be the 2 cents that I'm going to give to this conversation, I'd happily do so. And yeah, that's about all I have to say.
I just want to say thank you for sharing, Castile. And as I stated in the earlier part, CPC is here. And so I would like to have a broader conversation to see how we can, what type of topics, if you put some topics in the chat, that some deeper dives that we can elevate and support your situation. It's not just your situation, it's a community situation, but I get it and I understand. I've been impacted myself in many ways. So I'm not, if I was dismissive towards you, please accept my apology and thank you for sharing tonight. Let's see. Okay. So we're Austin, go ahead. We're going to do our Commissioner Austin, and then David, and then Shailene, go ahead with the chat after David.
Oh, I can wait until more community folks talk. I'll just I'll cede my time, and then I'll put my hand back up if I want to talk later.
Thank you for that. David?
Hi, Dr. Estelli. My name is David Della, and I'm a former city council member back in the early 2000s. early on in this process, and I was actually a member of the Public Safety Committee. I have more of a process question. Besides your extensive report about use of force and these conversations that the CPC is having, is there a mechanism built in for regular reporting to either the council or the community to, you know, on an ongoing basis as we are working our way through this, to allow comments along the way, other than these conversations?
Well, thanks, David. And thanks for the history of all the work you've put in on this. If I'm understanding your question correctly, you know, I think there, yes, broadly. So we do put out, you know, the monitoring team puts out these assessments. And so there's always room there via the monitoring website to provide feedback and ideas. These forums, of course, like you just mentioned, and CPC holds regular meetings, you know, broadly around policing for you to provide feedback in. SPD, of course, has an online dashboard which has a number of the measures, you know, data on that dashboard, not all of it, and that's something we need to work on, is make sure that there's increasingly more data there. And so feedback can be, you know, you can look at that and do analysis and even download data sets, run your own analysis if you know, are so inclined, and advocate for certain things based on your findings. So there are a number of inputs there for that. As long as the monitoring team is here as well, you can email me directly or go onto the monitoring website if you have ideas or questions, and we'll certainly would enjoy, you know, receiving those. The more ideas, the better. So there are a number of different ways that you can provide input on all this. If that answers your question, is that?
Yeah, and in addition, is the council requiring a regular reporting of where we're at with this? Because that is part of the public process, is reporting to the community council committee.
Yeah, so in multiple ways. One is that all these assessments will be filed. One, they're available publicly in the preliminary form, and they'll be filed with the court as a you know, as a comprehensive assessment. We'll put all of them together, and City Council has been briefed on that regularly, pretty much monthly, on where the status is of it and the process and the progress. And so particularly Councilmember Herbold, who, you know, leads up the Public Safety Committee, and City Council President Juarez as well. So there is a general cadence there of communication and updates to City Council.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Okay, it looks like, sorry, it looks like we have Howard Gale. Howard, is your hand still up from before, or is this a new hand? Okay, go ahead, Howard, and then we'll move on to Malik.
Okay, sorry, couldn't unmute. You know, again, let's go back to some higher level stuff, because I see a lot of people in the chat asking about what do you do with data, and Dr. Ofteli, I think you did give an answer which is actually more disturbing than helpful. You know, look, I was at Harvard during some pretty horrible scandals in my department, psychology. And the way those scandals were uncovered, this is research, you know, is data gets audited. People ask questions. People say, I want to interview the people that you claim were in your study. Looking at statistics, these statistics don't make sense. So there are ways to look at data and to do audits. I think one way, for example, well, there's two ends of the spectrum one can approach this from. One is simply sampling, taking 10, you know, just randomly taking 10.
Actually, just let me, the monitoring team does do that, right? So we do look backs, we do sampling, we do look at, we do that already. So just.
Well, I think but I think somehow that has to be, you know, again, this isn't to suggest that I don't trust you, but, you know, again, there is this problem of knowledge, right? So for example, like I just said, it would be hard for you, not being at demonstrations, not having lived in Seattle for 20 years, to know that instead of beating people with batons, the preference now is to beat people with bicycles. It hurts a lot more and you can get away with it. You don't have to swing a big baton. That's a reality. Okay. So at the other end of the spectrum, we can also ask questions like, instead of debating statistics and numbers, again, I've asked this question, people are sick of it, but it's the most important question. Why have we killed 16, 17, 18 people in the last 10, 11 years who are in mental health crisis? The whole point of the Community Police Commission, it's ensconced in the Seattle Municipal Code as to what the CPC is supposed to do. One of their tasks is not to look at individual cases, but to look at patterns. In the 10 years of existence, how have they failed to see Charlene Lyles, Ryan Smith, Terry Kaver, the person in January? I could go on and on. So many people with edged weapons or a bottle or nothing getting shot dead. That is a failure. That's not a question of the CPC not having power. That power is actually given to them right in the Seattle Municipal Code, but it hasn't been used. So those are the two ways I think we can actually look at actually, there's three things we need. We need spot checks, which you claim you've done, but again, I think it has to be done by an entity that's not part of the system. Two, we have to answer basic questions, which is what brought the Department of Justice here, about individual cases. So one of the things you mentioned in your report, which I find very disturbing, is you talk about, I won't even read it, but it's in the report about different perspectives. Some people want to defund police. Some people, want more police. Some people want to abolish police. That's not the point. If I'm the FDA, I'm not asking the question, some people like chocolate, some people like vanilla, some people like strawberry. I'm asking, is it going to kill you? I'm asking a qualitative question. And if one person dies eating the chocolate or strawberry ice cream, that's the concern. If one plane goes down, that's the concern. But we're somehow turning this on its head and talking about, oh, out of 50,000 contacts, only 3 people got killed. What's the big deal? So again, I think what we need to look at are individual cases, which was what brought the DOJ here, and investigate them. I think we need to verify how the SPD is acquiring its statistics and writing its reports. We need audit trails for use of force. We need more transparency. What's on the dashboard right now, for instance, the officer-involved shooting dashboard hasn't been updated in 2 years. For instance, the crisis intervention data is missing the level of use of force. And again, as I've already stated, in the 6.5 years that data set represents, 9 people in crisis are missing from it. So the other thing that people are asking in the chat, and I want to respond to, is what are our alternatives? We're stuck in sort of a make-believe world in its own terms. Nashville,
we're gonna go to the chat.
Yeah, I mean,
okay, but Nashville, but let me just make a very quick point here. Nashville, Newark, after George Floyd, every city. I mean, how dare you say in your report that Seattle, through their Sentinel event review process, is doing something unique? Yes, it is doing something unique. It's doing something failed and unique because 12 other cities voted in the fall of 2020 through an initiative process to actually have civilian oversight, one-stop shop civilian oversight, like they have in Nashville.
We know, Dr. Gill, that that's your thing, and I don't say I don't disagree. Right? That's it's not the purview of the Seattle Police Monitor to set up a civilian, completely civilian review board. Where we can agree on is that I do think, which I cannot do as monitor because I'm prohibited from doing it, but I do think the city, CPC, and collaboration with others should do a review of people killed over these past 10 years or n number of years, whichever way you want to look, to see where things can be improved. There's a number of different lenses to look at those OISs from, to better understand what happened, to learn from them, to make policy change, practice change, that should be explored and looked at. I think you're right in that they maybe have not been analyzed in a way that's conducive to making sure it doesn't happen again. Right now, as kind of a personal / professional hat on, I, for one, if you said with what happened to Sherry Caber, would that happen again in Seattle? And I don't know. It probably could, right? And is there a way to minimize the chance of that happening again? And the way to minimize it is through policy and practice change. And so that review should take place. And so somehow we can all collectively, community, CPC, others, do some form of review on that. It should happen. Felicia, other questions?
Hi, sorry, I was Eileen here. We also have Malik Davis has his hand raised. Malik, are you ready to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had to step away, Mr. Monitor, so I don't know if you saw my question about, does anything prevent you and the judge from commenting on the labor contract just before it gets inked? But if you haven't, I'd appreciate your comment on that. And then second, I wanted to say to you and Ron in particular, I work at the city and I see all the emails that come through, and I'm telling you, I don't see the conversations that you're referring to being addressed, right? So my heart goes out to all these points that I see, but when I see the OIG's second wave report presented at a city council meeting, and then I don't see CPC, I don't see OIG, I don't see OPA, I don't see city council, and I don't see the mayor's office. I don't see any of them talking about what document was just produced and what we all have culpability in and doing something differently on behalf of the people of Seattle. You just said that you briefed the public safety chair on this. Dr. Affatelli, where did the substance of you briefing the chair go? Right? So I'm encouraging you, one, to comment on where you and the judge can help us on the contract, and two, where you can, in internal conversations and the judge, encourage Seattle leadership to talk to each other. Because I want somebody to go back and say Malik Davis said this, and then to say I'm lying, that somehow city leadership is talking to each other, because it is not.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Malik. So we did address the issue about the union contract a little bit earlier, but to recap on that, it is one of these challenging areas where, unfortunately, because of the rules, in the city, the monitor I can't see behind the scenes with anything related to the contract. I won't see it until you see it, and the court will not see it until you see it. The court has signaled some things that would be very important to have in that next contract. Very clearly when the last contract came forward and the city was found out of compliance with accountability, the court, the judge relayed a number of items that would be very important to have from the court's perspective in this upcoming contract. We are hoping that the city is working very diligently on that in their negotiations, but unfortunately we can't see behind the scenes of that. There's nothing we can do to influence those negotiations. So it's one of these blind spots that I wish we could help with. We can't. That being said, when good for good or bad, when the contract is done, and the court will likely have something to say about it at that point in time, and it's somewhat unfortunate because it's afterwards. But
is there a law? Is there a law that says you guys can't?
I think we talked about this a bit earlier in the session here today. I think we're going to take a look at that because and maybe Ron, if you're in the background doing Ron Ward, some little research on that, or maybe but my assumption is that there's something in statute in the city that that has those boundaries around who can be part of that negotiation process. I know I have been told by the city attorney's office in Seattle that it's not something the monitor can be in the room in, right? I can't even see any preliminary.
I understand you can't be in the room, but the city of Seattle needs you and the judge to chime in, right? And I don't know if you're talking directly to the guild, but you and the judge have a private conversation with the guild and the city negotiators I'm pretty sure the people of Seattle would be happy that you're having those closed door conversations. It's just what's frustrating is to hear the judge say after the fact, the 2017 accountability ordinance became worthless because of what the council voted for in 2018 to accept the contract. To hear the judge say after the fact that y'all might be out of compliance with the consent. Well, come on.
Yeah.
Why can't we just do right and be adults?
Malik, I 100% agree with you. I wish that entire process could be, we could all be involved in it and designing that and negotiating it. I'm right there with you.
Could I have a comment? Because the judge ordered the city to work with the CPC back in 2019, when the judge said that the city was out of compliance on the police accountability system. And the previous mayor never did work on that. We were supposed to come up with a methodology to fix the accountability system. You've heard me more than once tell you that, Dr. Oftelli. More than once I've said that. And it was no movement with the previous mayor. So nothing happened. She was not called. I mean, the judge never said she was out, out of what is it when you don't follow the rules? I mean, nothing happened on that piece. So the judge had ordered the city to work with the Community Police Commission, the OIG, and the OPA to fix the accountability system because the city was out of compliance on the accountability system. Although accountability was not part of a finding, the DOJ did not agree with that ruling. So nothing happened. So I want the people to know that nothing happened. It's not because we didn't do it. The judge ordered the city to fix it, and the city never did call the parties together to come up with a methodology. And so therefore they're moving forward on this place right here for these who are being presented for the last 4 meetings, but there's still no methodology to fix the accountability system that the judge ordered them to do in 2019. And a lot of people wasn't here. They might not have been part of the city council, but that's really what happened. I mean, and if people don't believe it, you can go back and find the judge's ruling. We filed in 2019 after the contract was signed. We asked the city not to sign the contract because the appendix says if the contract is signed and then you don't have an agreement, you go back to the previous contract. That was 2005. So that's just where we are. It's not that the CPC is ineffective. It's the fact that the people who do the bargaining did not either bargain well, or our issues was not on the table. Okay, you don't know when they set the table. So anyway, the table was set back in 2014. The initiative for the ordinance was passed in 2017. That was a chronological events. And so I can tell you the chronological events. 2018, we asked the city not to sign the contract because it was going to take us back to 2005. It was unanimous. It might not have been unanimous, but they signed the contract. And so this is where we are. So that's the truth. I'm sticking by it. So anybody else got anything else to say, but that's the truth. So they can find it out for themselves. Go find it out. You can read all of this for yourself. You can read the judge's ruling and all of that for yourself. Thank you.
Okay, Malik, I'm not sure if that answers all your questions, but the other part just with around communication across the different entities in the city, it's the Seattle way, right? You're in there, right? So it's always a constant thing to move forward, collaboration across the parties, getting them to agree and to move forward on things. It takes time, right?
Yes. And you and the judge are uniquely positioned to be out of towners and third parties to remind Seattle leadership that it could help the CPC a lot more than it does. Period. Either it be staffing, either it be research, either it be helping to move forward the SPD recommendation tracker. I'm telling you, I'm at the city. I don't see when any of these directors in these departments talk about the CPC recommendation tracker. Never.
It's a Felicia.
You
Maybe
don't
that
have
would
to
be one of those
comment on
items.
that.
we should
You don't have to
definitely.
comment on that. I'm encouraging you to just see you are uniquely positioned to have these kind of, forgive me, folks, but where I come from, this is called come to Jesus meetings. You have an opportunity to sit in a private meeting with the mayor, with the city chair, with the OPA heavies, with Lisa, with everybody. With Gil, you and the judge could call them up and they all got to respond to you. They ain't got to respond to Howard Gale, right? But they got to respond to you. And you have a unique opportunity to convey to them, right, that they need to do better in support of the CPC. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
I think, Shailene, do you have it?
Yeah, I'm here. So actually
Thank
next, I
you.
believe it says Tyrone's hand, but I think it's actually Julia. Are you still with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Julia, we can hear you.
Amazing. Thank you, technology. I want to first say Ramadan Mubarak. Just as I was called on to speak tonight, the Adhan went off. And so please bear with me. This is the end of a very long day of fasting. So shout out to all the Muslims out there tonight in this meeting. I see you. I am challenging myself tonight to not laugh. You know, there's a certain point when you're just in the midst of such what's an appropriate word, of such disillusion that it's impossible to not laugh, just as we have in all of the other moments throughout our ancestral history. When we have nowhere else to go, we must laugh at our ridiculousness, at the fact that we have even reached the bottom and therefore know that there is literally no deeper to go. So I'm going to get straight to the point, straight to my point. But before I do, Felicia, lovely to see you. I'd love being in any space with you, and I miss you. So I'm
Thank you,
looking
my
forward
darling.
to taking you absolutely up on your invitation, which I felt in my heart to reach out and to continue this work in the benefit and in the interest of those who have been most affected and harmed by these historically and persistently racist, institutionalized processes that have not been designed to serve us. So again, I go back. Let me get straight to the point. I have listened very intently, have taken copious notes on all of the concerns that should be represented in all of the things that I'm actually reading on the other side of the screen. What I am paying attention to tonight are the comments. What I'm listening to and what my heart understands as a familiar song is the voice I'm most likely to dance towards. Because honestly, at this point in my life, I don't have time for disillusionment. I absolutely understand. And at a point in our human evolution, in our own individual and personal experiences on this planet, we have all experienced that point where we have found ourselves in the middle of a huge, messy knot that yet we did not make, we have inherited. And every single hand that it passes through, it gets just a little bit messier. So do you understand what it would take for the person just walking into this space to have an objective understanding of what's actually being said here on both sides? Who could possibly miss the disconnect? There is an absolute evidence of a disconnect between what is being said in the community, how we are valuing and documenting and including the narrative of our humanity into these numbers, which honestly, I don't trust. And it's not out of anything personal. It's literally out of experience. And I would be absolutely fooled. I would be suffering from cognitive dissonance myself should I continue to believe just everything that I'm given at face value? Knowing what I know, because I'm hearing both sides, you see. And so what my concern is, and I, as a representative of the Seattle Human Rights Commission, what I am dedicated to, not only in that role, but in my personal life, and to inculcate into the lives of my children and everyone around me, is to listen. And it's lovely to have conversations. We've been having conversations like exactly like this one for 10 years plus. I mean, that's being generous. If you really want to get into the weeds, we, and when I say we, I mean people who have been most affected by, have been presenting solutions year after year after year. So you have to imagine at some point, it's foolish to continue to accept or expect different results. You see, and honestly, one of the things that grates worst on my ears as an advocate for equity is, oh, that's how we've always done it. And in this situation, it translates into, well, that was a good idea 10 years ago. How many of the ideas 10 years ago do we still think are great ideas? I guess it depends on who you ask. Whose status quo has been maintained over the last 10 years? I personally, and as a representative of the Seattle Human Rights Commission, feel like we are ready to have a different approach. And with the absolute conscious decision to not fall for the same pitfalls that have come to those before us, mainly competition. I don't like it. It doesn't represent equitable practices, and it absolutely does not represent what we see in terms of a future where my humanity as a Black Muslim woman is wholly and fully respected by default, no matter where I am. So what I'm proposing and what I'm asking of the CPC is that in partnership, we can together represent the actual voice, not the one who has been sifted through and edited and then translated into a literal number on a page. I am excited. Why? Because we have chance to do new things. It is so apparent, you know, like with this whole knot, it's like if you put yarn in a dryer. This is what I'm feeling like I'm in the middle of. And I don't know who in this space isn't frustrated with somebody else. So at some point, thank you, Malik, for invoking our humanity. Thank you, Castile, for invoking our humanity and saying, I thought we were all grown-ups here. Is anybody in this space actually benefiting from this double talk speak? Like, I'm cutting the Gordian knot. You go on ahead and do whatever it is that you feel is appropriate and necessary using the mechanics and tools that you have at your disposal, meaning the ones that we have been witnessing tonight, all AKA every single source of data collection that you've ever reached out towards and integrated into your own. Like, go ahead and do that. Nobody's stopping you. You know what I mean? Like, you want to go play with your ball of yarn, it's fine. But I'm just going to let you know that as a favor to yourself and to those involved in creating and maintaining this big messy ball of yarn, hey, guess what? We can help you straighten stuff out. Like, find that path back to your humanity. Because if we are absolutely honest with ourselves and listen and value our intuition, our gut feeling, that feeling when you are absolutely proud of yourself for the product, for your work product, where you have exhausted every absolute avenue of contributions from every possible source, then we shall celebrate together. But honestly, I don't know, just speaking positionality wise, if that's even a possibility for those who I've heard from tonight, Dr. Ofteli. Honestly, just positionality speaking, I understand the limitations. Like this isn't my first rodeo. I understand politics exists, but I don't care is the difference. You see, in this situation that we have suffered from over the last 10 years, it's not that we don't lack love. It's that our love has lacked power. And you know what Martin Luther King said about that? Love without power is sentimentality. And he also said, power without love is recklessness. And what I have seen tonight is recklessness. What I need to see is love combined with power. We will have to understand and determine that there is a translation issue here. That these actual voices of these individuals that we have, thank you for incorporating the bits of humanity and remembering throughout your presentation tonight that yes, we are more than numbers. I mean, that's obvious. That's obvious. I heard him maybe a couple of times. Yeah, I did see it. That's for me, that is the result of anti-bias training and checkbox marking. What I actually look for beyond just sentiments and words and catchphrases is actual action. And after repeatedly seeing the same outcome, I am the one, the resident, the citizen, the one most affected. I now am the one who is experiencing cognitive dissonance. I keep trying the same approach, meet them with reason, and it doesn't work. So at this point, there is no longer the ability to hold the singular voice of those whom obviously, looking at the comments alone themselves in this one meeting, I'm not even Googling it yet. It seems to me at this point, it would be behooving upon us as a community to ask the CPC at this point, would you be willing to write a brief to the court outlining the concerns of our residents that I have heard not just tonight, but ever since I have ever learned of police accountability? Is there a willingness for the CPC to write a brief outlining and documenting everything that we have heard from our most affected? Is there room? So I'm not expecting an answer tonight, and I have not a single question. There is nothing I don't understand about what's going on tonight, but I do very much appreciate the opportunity to speak last. And I'm not thinking just the hosts, but for all of those who were brave enough, had the capacity, the intellect, the experience, the wherewithal, the time to come and speak your truth, our truth, because not a single person here spoke for themselves tonight. I will guarantee you that. Guarantee you that. So all of those who came before me, nothing but my gratitude. So thank you again. I do want to respect our time, 8:06. So with that, I turn it back over.
Thank you, Julia. Thank everybody for all these heartfelt. I mean, Dr. Ofteli, I don't know what to say. You have to walk away feeling the passion. No answer needed. I don't know, Reverend Walden, I'm not wanting to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you can answer to Julia's question, or should we be able to get back to her with an answer for that? I'm sorry, maybe she's not there.
No, I'm here. I can answer part of the question because as having amicus status, we cannot petition the court. We can only answer, we can only file on what has already been filed in the court. So amicus status does not give us a way. We cannot approach the judge to say, this is what we've heard. Now we can respond like we did when the judge asked us to respond, or when we responded to when the judge was upset about what had happened and asked the city about the contract after it was already signed. He asked us, we were able to respond to that, but we are not petitioners of the court. Amicus status does not give you a right to be petitioners of the court. And Ron is on there. Ron could also speak to that, but we're not petitioners of the court. So we cannot petition the court. We can only file on the city's brief, like we did in 2020 when the city tried to come from under consent decree. We filed saying that we didn't think the city was ready to come from under consent decree. We outlined all the reasons why we think it was not ready, and that was a proper filing. Otherwise, then we can't file because we're not petitioners in that way. And so I think Ron might, Ward might still be on there. He's an attorney, so he could speak to this legally. I'm not an attorney, but he knows about the court.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Ron.
I could not give a more lawyerly answer with greater clarity than what Reverend Walden just set forth.
Okay.
That is the case.
Thank you. Julie, I hope that helps a little, but it doesn't mean it's over. We have to do what we have to do. And so with that, Austin, I want you to please go ahead with your question, and then we're going to close out. I know it's 10 minutes after. We got started a little bit late, but anybody that needs to drop off, no disrespect to us. But Austin, please ask your question, and then we're just going to wrap it up from here and talk about topics for future meetings and where we want to go. It sounds like the contract one. I have down the contract, Julia's concerns, and voices of those who have been harmed by the police. And also, there was one other thing I had. Yeah. So anything you guys have on your list, please email me, put it in the chat, and we're capturing everything, and we're gonna put together a robust list of topics going forward for our community police commission. All together now. That's Dr. Gail and everybody else. I'm not calling you out, Dr. Gail. I'm just saying we're all in this together. Austin, are you there? Is he still on? I can't
Oh no,
see.
I'm good. I do have to run. Thank you.
Okay. If there isn't anything else, thank you so much, Dr. Optelli, for enduring our meetings, and
pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
You know, I hope that you've gained some insights about Seattle and its community, and how passionate we are. We may not always agree about everything, but we come together. And we just want answers. That's all. Okay, if there's nothing else, good night, everybody. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.